Hello and welcome to the explanation from the BBC World Service. This is where we press pause on the busy 24-hour news cycle and dig a bit deeper behind the headlines.
Today the West Bank's nightmare started coming true.
Protesters were throwing bricks in there, using bamboo poles to smash vehicles.
It's a city where mothers carry guns, along with their groceries.
The spaces that people can run to for safety are shrinking every day here.
I'm Claire Graham, and with the help of my BBC colleagues around the world, I'll be trying to get a better understanding of the stories that matter to all of us. Today, Syria. How did a peaceful uprising lead to a decade-long civil war? Lina Sinjab is a Syrian journalist and a senior reporter for the BBC in the Middle East. Welcome to the explanation, Lina.
Thank you.
So our story really starts with the coming to power of Bashar al-Assad in July 2000. What can you tell us about him?
Perhaps the audience around the world remembers that Bashar al-Assad didn't come as an elected president, but actually they have changed the constitution to fit him in, if I may say, to inherit power from his father in 2000. And that was like a smooth kind of transfer of power because of the old guard that were, surrounding his father since he took power in the 70s. So Bashar al-Assad came from, a eye doctor background, educated in the UK, and suddenly he became Syria's president.
And how would you describe the character of the Assad regime?
I think the best way to describe the 10 years where he ran the country between 2000 and 2011, when the peaceful uprising started, is how one of the veteran dissidents in Syria described him: dictatorship without dictator. Crackdown on political activists or politicians, no multi-party system, no freedom of expression. There was actually a memorable moment in 2000 when he took power, where one of the women among the elite groups in Syria, she got an email of cartoon of Bashar al-Assad wearing a military suit that is bigger than his size, and she forwarded it to his friends. And she was put in jail for 6 months, and she was among the, aristocrats, Christian aristocrats of Damascus with connections to the regime. So it was clear from the beginning that you play by my rules, you live, you make a mistake, you're out.
Can you set the context for us in March 2011? What was happening in the wider regions at the time when those pro-democracy marches began?
The scenes in Tunisia, in Egypt, influenced what happened in Syria, in Libya. Young people across the Arab world no longer wait for the TV news bulletin at 7 or 8 p.m. in the evening to know what's happening around. They simply switch on their mobile phones and they can see their fellow citizens or people of their age, what they're doing across the Arab world.
It started here. Graffiti sprayed on this school wall called on President Assad to go. Teenage boys arrested, allegedly tortured. Anger boiled over. The first major protest happened here. Omari Mosque, a focal point. The first deaths in Dera too. Security forces struck back.
The more regime would suppress these protests, the more people go out across the city. So it started like a cluster influence across Syria, from town to town, village to village, city to city. And every Friday, you would see that more and more people are taking to the street. At the same time, the regime would intensify its crackdown.
In your reporting of the early years of the uprising, you witnessed dramatic changes to your home city of Damascus. Let's take a listen.
The first men we saw, they were controlling the road, checking on cars coming in and out, people cheerfully saluting them, and they seem to be relaxed and they just want to get rid of President Bashar al-Assad. Some women, they tell me, that are coming in and throwing kind of chips that would coordinate with satellites, and then the government can bombard the area. So that's why they have to be extra cautious about who do they allow into town. We're just walking near an area where a barrel of TNT was thrown yesterday. You can see loads of destruction, and It's just a civilian area that has been targeted, cars burnt out, building completely shattered and destroyed, windows broken.
I remember going to Dera just the second week of the uprising. As I was leaving the city, I saw a long line of tanks and military vehicles heading towards Dera. And for what? So simply because there are protesters who are going out in the street peacefully without any weapons, without anything, just with their voices, shouting out for justice, shouting out for the release of their children, shouting out for change.
The anti-government demonstrations are getting bigger and they're spreading. This is the center of Damascus. And this is the coastal city of Latakia. It's more proof that no Arab country is immune from the revolutionary mood that has swept the Middle East, demanding change, taking on authoritarian states. Killings in and around the southern town of Dera have sent people out onto the streets in protest across the country. Amnesty International says at least 55 people have been killed in Syria in the last week.
Was there a tipping point when opposition supporters started to take up arms?
It's different in different towns and cities, but I would say at least the first 2 years went unarmed. Of course, across the borders closer to other countries like Iraq and Turkey, there were more people holding up arms, but in the center of the country, in center of cities, people were still demonstrating peacefully, were still taking to the street peacefully, and they were still being arrested and killed and shot dead by security forces. But no matter how they got armed or got support from outside forces, there is like a scattered number of opposition holding up arms and weapons and pistols or RPGs, and there is a full-fledged regime army with tanks, with aircrafts, with warplanes, with MiGs, and you name it.
Aleppo is Syria's commercial centre and the country's largest city. Keeping control of it is vitally important to the Assad regime. There are huge numbers of well-armed government forces here determined to stop the rebel advance. Some of the heaviest fighting has been taking place at an infantry academy just outside the city, which is still in government hands. But in towns and cities across the country, including Damascus itself, lightly armed rebel fighters continue to take on their much better equipped enemy.
You mentioned there about outside forces. Who were the other players at that time and who were they backing?
If you look at Syria's map, it's the most complicated story to tell because of the different influences from regional and international. You have backers on the regime side and you have backers on the opposition sides. You have backers for the Kurds, you have backers for the Sunnis, you have backers for the regime, for the Shia, and it's too complicated. But mainly you have two powerful allies who stood by the regime from day one, like Russia and Iran. But later on, in September 2015, Russia was fully fledged involved in Syria and sent its troops and military bases to Syria to divert the track of that war.
Syrian state TV has followed the advance of government troops and their militia allies into what was rebel-held eastern Aleppo. For the regime, this is the biggest single victory of the war, but it doesn't mean the war is over. Instead, it's changing shape and has much more killing left in it. None of this would have happened without the intervention of the Syrian state's allies, Russia, Iran and Hezbollah, the Lebanese Shia militia. Another part of the new Middle East is coming into focus. This is a victory for a coalition that opposes the West and its regional allies.
On the opposition, you have the Arab world that differed in their position. You had Qatar supporting the opposition, mainly the Islamist one. You have Saudi Arabia, who supported another faction of the Islamist one. And the Emirates were flipping between this and that. You have the Europeans who supported different ones. The Americans mainly that supported the Kurds. The list is long.
The dynamics of the conflict would change again in late 2013 with the involvement of IS. so-called Islamic State.
The brutal militant Islamist group that called itself as the manning the power in northern Syria and in opposition areas. It was mainly created by Iraqi leaders and some Syrians and other Arab nationals and even international American, Belgium, French, and, several nationals who joined force of this extremist Islamic group. And that's why the world power felt that this is a trans-border movement, that its security threat will exceed the borders of Syria. And this is where the US-led coalition was created and started to fight ISIS in Syria.
Overnight, US might was unleashed on Sunni extremist targets in Syria, from these ship-launched cruise missiles to fighter aircraft to drones, and critically, the participation of the air forces of a number of other Arab countries. And in the clear light of day, the flattened buildings, the rubble, the twisted metal and chaos, the evidence of what had unfolded. And that coalition of Gulf states and Jordan was something the President stressed when he spoke at the White House this morning.
Last night, on my orders, America's armed forces began strikes against ISIL targets in Syria. The strength of this coalition makes it clear to the world that this is not America's fight alone. Above all, the people and governments of the Middle East are rejecting ISIL and standing up for the peace and security that the people of the region and the world deserve.
Also in 2013, a secret State Department cable from the US Consul General in Istanbul said there was compelling evidence that the Assad regime had authorised the use of chemical weapons against opposition forces the previous year.
New video today of the aftermath of the alleged chemical attack in Syria, and more tales of what exactly happened in the small hours of Wednesday morning.
My father, mother, all my sisters and brothers, plus at least 50 neighbours collapsed on the floor. I managed to bring my little sisters and 2 other girls to this field hospital, but nothing is left in Zamalka.
Meanwhile, in Washington, President Obama is now terming what happened a big event of grave concern. He urged the Assad government to allow a full UN inquiry.
Everyone knew if President Obama at that day, when he said this is a red line that you cannot cross by using chemical weapons, we knew that if the Americans were not going to attack the regime on that day, the brutality that the Syrians will face will be unprecedented after that. And that's exactly what happened. That's when we started to hear about barrel bombs, about massive attacks against civilians. And that's actually the point where Syrians felt that democracy and pro-democracy advocacy around the world, human rights, international rights, it's all a lie. The world left them to die day in, day out. Nobody cared.
We have diplomatic efforts along the way. Have there been key moments where people have thought there could be some sort of resolution, or what have been the key sticking points?
I've covered the Geneva peace talks in 2014, 15, and the last round I covered was 2016. That's when people started to feel the momentum is going down, and that's actually when the Russians took over the military operation in Syria and were involved on the ground. Russia was, speaking on behalf of the regime in international venues, in diplomatic efforts, making decisions. So I think that's when, many Syrians started to feel a real deadlock, that nothing is moving, that there are promises. There are several sessions and several talks that are taking place, mainly the UN High Representative for Syria is trying to get peace talks, change the constitution talks. Most of them were held in Astana, led by the Russians, involving the Turks, to create deals here and there. But actually, if you look at the bigger picture, nothing is moving, nothing is changing. And, the opposition, as much as they're fragmented and scattered, they're not able to push the agenda to the standards that the people on the streets called for in 2011 and 2012. There's no light at the end of the tunnel.
In the back alleys of Kisweh, the water tanker is getting through. Just. They come once a week. No one has running water here. More than a third of Kisweh's population has to rely on the UN. Water comes every few days by the bucket in this basement, where more than 200 people have taken shelter. Half of the families living here have already left for Europe, despairing of ever finding a life worth living here. And those who are left are completely dependent on outside aid like this. Syria has long been called the humanitarian test of our time. Now the test just keeps getting harder.
What has been the human cost? How many lives do we know have been lost?
I think the United Nations stopped counting after 500,000 being killed. But if you look at the reports and the numbers that the Syrian human rights organizations that have been counting, the number of the ones who are called dead exceeded 1 million. And the number of people who are still disappearing, that their families and their loved ones, they don't know their whereabouts, is over 120,000 Syrians who've disappeared since the uprising began. We have 6 million Syrian refugees. There is like over 1 million of them that reached Europe, mostly in Germany, but there are almost like 4 to 5 million in neighboring countries. Here in Lebanon, there is almost like 1 million refugees living in tents. You know, some of the children were born in these refugee camps. And inside Syria, you have 9 million. Imagine the number, 9 million internally displaced Syrian. So let's do the calculation again. In 2011, the population of Syria were like 21, 22 million Syrians. If we take the figures that the Syrian Human Rights Organization is saying that as correct, like 1 million dead, 6 million refugees, and then you have 9 million internally displaced, what is left of the population? Like 4-6 million, if I'm doing the math correct. It's become a country of poverty, and as UN, the humanitarian officials described it recently, hunger is a characteristic of Syria today.
You've been listening to The Explanation from the BBC World Service with me, Claire Graham. My guest today was Lena Sinjab. And if you'd like to hear more episodes of The Explanation, subscribe at BBC Sounds or wherever you get your podcasts.